Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. What a privilege it is and has been to have these 13 weeks of Talmud learning starting in 2023 that we are about to pause after today's class. But I did promise just a moment ago to all who had gathered here that I'm going to do a little bit of sharing up front in a housekeeping kind of way, just on thoughts about where this is going, because the professional staff and I have been in deep conversation for several weeks thinking about next year's calendar for the temple.
Something's wrong.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Judy. We all hear you. Are your computer? Can somebody private chat Judy, please? Or even if somebody's friends with Judy and has her on text, can give her a call, ask her if her computer speakers are on. I wish I could be more helpful. I just can't right now. I'm sorry. So somebody let her know that we hear her just fine, and that I think it's her computer speakers. Anyway, so where are we going from here? My vision is that our Talmud chevra, which is a Jewish word that means group or community. The word that I'm using for what we do here is shiur, which means a lesson or learning or session. Our Talmud shiur will continue. I view this as an ongoing way of learning. I would still love to expand the audience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to do that here at WRT. So first things first. And this is not an opportunity to comment whether you like this or don't like it. If you want to private message me, not through the chat window, you want to drop me an email with your thoughts afterward, that's wonderful. All feedback is a gift, even if it's critical. The intention is that this shiur, this Gemara or Talmud shiur, will be an ongoing offering of WRT, and that at least for next year, it will continue on Zoom. I want to articulate my reasons why. Number one, there has been strong feedback, both the kind that people write and say, and the kind that is assessed by the way people, quote unquote, vote with their feet, that this format works. It also allows us to connect people from distance. We have people who regularly tune in from their offices, like Russell De Silva, and others. We have people who tune in from states that are not close enough to Scarsdale, USA, for them to be here in person, but they count on being able to join us remotely. The timing, by the way, also works for people in other time zones to join us. Even if you're in Israel or in Great Britain or in Paris, or for that matter in California, it would not be unreasonable to join at 10:15 Eastern on a Thursday. I am not a fan of hybrid learning, where you have some people in person and some people not in person. We do that for Torah study. By the way, I'm not a fan of it at Torah study. I recognize that it serves some members of the community, but I think it does more of a disservice than a service to the community. I believe that learning should happen either all in person or all online. Some of it is also just the way we can access text online is much, much, much easier. It's also more environmentally responsible to look at a Safari, a share screen, than to hand out many, many, many pages of photocopied material, though that is not my biggest concern. I think that it is easier to access text when I, as the teacher, can say, on a screen, we're looking at this line here, as opposed to handing out a paper handout where I have to say, count 20 lines down from the top, look at the third word in, that's the word we're looking at today. A lot of time is spent when I teach in-person groups just getting people on the same page. I am not spending a lot of time getting all of us on the same page. And then finally, I think that the quality of our learning has not been diminished by not being able to actually hug each other and shake each other's hands and look each other in the eye, though I recognize that the quality of the community is not helped by the distance in real space. To that end, we will be creating at least I think, quarterly opportunities to do an in-person session like the shiurim that we did at the end of our Pirkei Avot study. So I'll make it my commitment to do periodic gatherings, not hybrid study, where we'll do special learning on a selected topic in person next year, both at our regularly scheduled time, but also on the off weeks, but also some evening learning, some midweek learning, maybe some weekend learning. In addition, we're going to be doing the winter movie series again, which was very popular. We're going to have a whole new slate of movies. Our cantors are putting together a series of music salons, probably also on Sunday afternoons, though that is TBD. We're doing a lot of learning next year, but we're also learning from what people are not coming to. So I'm not going to overplay my hand and tell you everything that we're planning for next year. It's also an anniversary year for WRT. We're celebrating our 70th year, 2023 to 2024. And we're gonna have a lot of special content next year. We have some wonderful guests, speakers, scholars, comedians, musicians, artists in residence that are going to make our calendar year for in-person engagement very robust and joyful indeed. So I don't want anyone to feel that, the fact that we will continue to have an online learning session on a mostly weekly basis means that we are somehow not engaging robustly in person. We very much are. So those are a few thoughts on that. I'm also delighted to announce that though we are going on hiatus after today, next week is Shavuot, Thursday night, May 25th. We'd love for you to come in person to our Shavuot service, where our confirmation class, 15 wonderful 10th graders who are finishing their year of study, social action, community building, and prayer, are going to be leading our worship for Shavuot. That's a wonderful evening. That's next Thursday evening at 6 p.m. The 25th. All are welcome, not just families of confirmands. We'd love the whole community to be there. And we have a number of wonderful speakers from within the community who are going to be our Friday night Darshanuyot. There's a special night on June 23rd with Pete Malinverni and his jazz trio. We're going to do jazz outside in the tent. So there's going to be some awesome stuff coming up. Also, you can mark Tuesday, August 9th, where WRT will partner up with Kol Ami for our annual Outdoor on the Lawn summer stage concert. Theme and personnel to be determined, but expect to hear all of your cantors, at least one of your rabbis, at least one of your Rebbitzins, and the amazing team at Kol Ami, including cantor Danny Mendelson. So that's Tuesday, August 9th. Rain date is that Thursday, I think. Okay, a couple of other thoughts, and then I'll stop talking, but thank you for listening. I also want to share with you that our Talmud shiur is going to resume in August. We are going to do a 4-week lead up to the high holidays for Elul. So August 17th, which is a Thursday morning, will be our next June Zoom session. The 17th, 24th, 31st, and September 7th will be 4 weeks corresponding to the 4 weeks of the Hebrew month of Elul for Talmud study and spiritual preparation for the high holidays. So we're actually going to be looking at signature Talmudic passages on the high holidays to get us ready for the holy season. I'm delighted that at least 3 of those sessions will be co-taught by Cantor Kleinman. Amanda is an absolutely brilliant student of and teacher of Talmud, and she and I are team teaching. I've basically filled the fall. We're going to take a pause for the high holidays, and then during the week of Sukkot, we're going to come back to our study and go all the way through Hanukkah, pretty much every week except for Thanksgiving. We're going to take a little pause, but come right back at it. We're going to take a pause for January and February, but we're going to come right back at it in early March. And when we get close to Pesach, which is late next year, it's at the end of April or near the end of April, Cantor Kleinman is going to join me again for 4 weeks of study preparing for Pesach. And so one of the things that I'm thinking of is the design of the course. I really like the idea of proceeding through the Gemara topically as opposed to chronologically. Instead of taking a whole tractate and burrowing down deep into the weeds, where you've seen Talmud can get very, very weedy. Instead, we're going to look at topics and do kind of like a cross-textual analysis, the way we have been. So the theme of this year, we did a potpourri 5 weeks of introduction, and today is actually session 8, our 13th total lesson this semester, on the question of suffering. We took one detour to do a pre-Seder, pre-Pesach study, but everything else we've looked at has contemplated. Again, we did 5 weeks on the mechanics of Talmudic argument and discourse and rabbinic authority. And then we did 1 week on Passover and 7 weeks on suffering. And you've still made it. You've been amazing. Today, we're going to look at our final text on suffering. And then next fall, or starting in August, actually, later this summer, we're going to do 4 weeks getting ready for the high holidays. And then I haven't quite figured all the rest out yet, but I'm really thinking that doing like a deep spiritual inquiry into the meaning of the Jewish holidays as viewed through the lens of Gemara would be a wonderful way to go through the year. And would give me a chance to go deeper into my own studies. A lot of this material is familiar to me, and a lot of it is not. Okay, you've been very patient listening to me yak at you, but thank you. I wanted to do housekeeping up front so that the rest of our time, an hour and 15 minutes, can all be Gemara. So we've already said a bracha. Let us proceed into today's learning. By way of a brief recap, we spent 3 full sessions looking at Tractate Brachot, pages 5a and b. Those pages entertained the various reasons for and responses to the question of human suffering, particularly good people who suffer, and inversely bad people who prosper. It looks like, Jane, you were able to help Judy. Awesome. Great. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Judy, for your patience and for sticking with it.
I'm sorry, I'm both. I'm just listening on my phone and watching. I will keep my mouth closed.
Understood. Yeah, there's a bit of an echo and something going on with your speakers, and I'm sorry. Those tech headaches are the worst kinds of headaches.
Thank you.
At least the worst kinds of like first world headaches.
I'm in Montclair. I'm with my.
That's why. See, it's New Jersey's fault. Okay. No, I spent some time in New Jersey. I was in Edgewater this week, meeting with a wedding couple on Mother's Day, and also doing an unveiling in Paramus. And New Jersey has some beautiful things too. Okay. I ate at the Palm Terrace in Edgewater. It's really old school, but it's wonderful. Okay. So in terms of what we looked at the last few weeks, I want to summarize that many of us felt a sense of distress around the way in which we could, I would say our distress was empathy for the rabbis who also were in a state of emotional and spiritual distress as they grappled with the conundrum of good people who suffer. Particularly wanting to affirm that suffering is real, and not that this is an imagined condition or that they're not really suffering, though we're going to get, I think I want to qualify that, but also affirm the existence and pervasive presence of a God who is all powerful and all good. And these 3 things do not coexist easily. A God who is all good and all powerful, who exists and who must be affirmed. People who are righteous, and righteous people who suffer, and suffering is real. It's very hard to make all of those declarative sentences be true all at the same time. And so the rabbis introduce us to a concept which is one of their ways of working through, or even working around, this conundrum. I would say working through, which is the idea of yisurin shel ahava. The idea that one suffers not because one is being punished, but because one is so beloved by God. Again, for many of us, that it's a theological non-starter. I'm perfectly willing to say I'm among those people. I don't think suffering is a demonstration of God's love, but I empathize with the rabbis who, out of their own spiritual distress, observing the human condition and still wanting to affirm a good God, a good omnipresent, omnipotent God, what distress that prompts in the rabbis. I empathize with them, even if I don't reach the same conclusions. And we went down lots of rabbit holes with the rabbis. We talked about the different kinds of suffering that might be a demonstration of God's love as opposed to God's punishment, such as infertility, or what would have been called in their day barrenness, or children, God forbid, who die, or the suffering brought about by terrible disease. And all of these the rabbis take up as possible demonstrations, not that one is being punished for transgression, but that one is variously so beloved by God that only they suffer, only the righteous suffer, or that suffering has a kind of expiatory function. We talked about that a lot last week, that suffering cleanses one of transgression and sin. I'm not asking you to accept these theological premises. I'm asking you to understand where they come from and what they mean for the community by whom they were written, for whom they were written. Now, with all that, I hope that where we concluded our learning last week was a nechemta for you. Nechemta is a wonderful Aramaic word derived directly from the Hebrew word nacham, which means comfort. That great aria near the beginning of Handel's Messiah, the libretto, comfort ye, my people, from the prophet Isaiah. Nachamu, nachamu ami. It's the haftarah, the prophetic reading for Shabbat Nachamu, which is always read in the summer when we begin the book of Deuteronomy. After Tisha B'Av, the rabbis gave us a cycle of weekly haftarot, or prophetic readings, to be read publicly on Shabbat, taken from the book of Isaiah, each of which provides a message of comfort to the suffering Jewish people. Tisha B'Av is the commemoration of national destruction, the destruction of the temples. The next 7 weeks, we hear a message of comfort. Nachamu is the word that Isaiah uses in the imperative plural form, meaning comfort, bring comfort, plural. Nachamu, nachamu ami, declares the Lord your God, comfort, comfort, comfort my people. And that takes us all the way to the week after 7, which is Rosh Hashanah. So there's this beautiful arc of destruction, Tisha B'Av, and then 7 weeks of comfort, and then we reach a new year and all the possibilities of a new year. It's quite beautiful when you think about the deliberate architecture of the scriptural readings for each week. Comfort is also associated with the custom of never ending a haftarah reading or a public teaching on a note that would depress your audience. In other words, you don't end a sermon by saying, and so, my friends, you are all culpable for your sins. Shabbat shalom. Like, that's not Jewish. You have to end on a note of comfort. Something that is called, from the Aramaic, from the Hebrew, a nechemta. I hope that my concluding portion, our concluding learning from last week, that you have the opportunity to view on YouTube if you weren't with us, or if you'd like to review, was a nechemta for the many theological and spiritual and emotional challenges you may have experienced in the long discussion about yisurin shel ahava, the chastisements or suffering prompted by love. Because we ended with 3 anecdotes associated with Rabbi Yochanan, who was variously portrayed as both a healer and a patient. And what I want to summarize from all of those little maisas, or ma'asim, those little anecdotes about the actual doings of an actual rabbi and his pupil or teacher, I think pupils, Elazar and Hanina, is that they show us that the way we transcend the argument over why human beings suffer is by showing up for somebody else with chesed, with love, with compassion. That at the end of the day, the rabbis, as it were, seem to be saying, let us talk no more about the why of suffering, and let us instead consider the way in which we can respond to suffering with our humanity, with our empathy, with our compassion, with our presence. And I think that that's an extraordinary nechemta, and not just sugarcoating something very difficult. I think it's a very Jewish answer that there is no answer to the why of suffering. The only answer is, how will you respond? Now that you are in this position where you are aware of your own or somebody else's suffering, now what? Now what shall you do? Because you'll never get a satisfactory answer to the why. And that is the nechemta that leads us into our final contemplation of the question of suffering, at least for this semester's Gemara study, where we're going to switch tractates. We're going to look at a page from tractate Ta'anit. Ta'anit is a Hebrew word that means a fast day. So some of you may be familiar with a minor fast on the Jewish calendar called Ta'anit Esther, or if you grew up in an Ashkenazi pronunciation household, Tanis Esther. Ta'anit Esther, the fast of Esther, is the day before Purim and commemorates the way in which Esther fasted before petitioning the king and risking her own life to save the Jewish people. So often, in moments of great peril for the community of the Jewish people, a fast was invoked. Similarly, fast days were called by the priest or the courts in order to petition God for rainfall and whatever. And the entire tractate of Ta'anit gets very deep into the role of fasting and fasting to end a drought or a famine. So it's a very interesting tractate. I am hardly an expert in tractate Ta'anit, but many questions of suffering, particularly the communal dimension of suffering. We've been looking at the individual or personal dimension of suffering. The communal dimension of suffering is a through line, a motif, a thread, a theme that the tractate of Ta'anit in its entirety gives us to contemplate. So that we're going to look at one small, beautiful page, which brings us a few representations of exactly this through line or thread that I'm describing, the communal nature of suffering and how the individual experiences that and responds to it. Alan, do you want to comment since I see you're unmuted?
I'm unmuted by mistake, so I apologize. Okay. Although I was thinking about Fast of the Firstborn, which is also a little bit of suffering commemorating the final plague. But that's not why I'm unmuted. But the interesting thing about what you just said, since I'm on the topic, is that it's not a full fast. You are alleviated from fasting if you study after you start the fast.
Thank you for reminding me of that custom. I've forgotten that.
Well, you're not a firstborn.
I am, actually.
Oh, you are?
I'm a firstborn man. Yeah. Yeah. Come on. If you've ever met my sister, you'll know immediately which one is the firstborn and which one is the secondborn. Becky has all the fun. I was the rule follower. We're very conventionally firstborn, secondborn. Anyway, mom and dad are laughing. That comment was directly for you guys. Okay. So I do not choose to fast on the day before Purim. I need my strength so that I can drink heavily on Purim. Never go into Purim on an empty stomach. Okay, let's take a look at Ta'anit, chapter Daf 11, page 11a. I'll give you just the briefest of kind of like orientations to what we're looking at. I have to get the correct tab here. Ta'anit 11a. If you use Sepharia and you'd like to follow up on this, Sepharia numbers where we're starting paragraph 3. I'll just say near the top of Ta'anit 11a. Okay, this is what we're looking at. And it's very interesting. What does this have to do with starvation? Well, or famine, that's going to come clear immediately. And the context is there's a whole series of very interesting passages about how much food you're allowed to eat or how much food you should eat during a time of famine, because you still have to live. So it's a lot about rationing. And what about when you're traveling where you have to provision yourself for the journey? And so they're talking about different kinds of provisioning yourself for a journey on foot or a journey by boat, or this passage, which I love, which is immediately before the one we're looking at. When Rav Papa traveled, along each and every parasang, farsah, which is, I don't know, it's a fairly long unit of distance, he would eat 1 loaf of bread. In other words, a lot. He really would kind of gorge himself the way marathon runners do the night before a race. Rav Papa did so because he maintained that the prohibition was due to the bowels. In other words, he concluded that any restrictions on eating before a big trip or during a big trip weren't so much about rationing food, and they were more about preserving your health, because it's not good to travel with a full stomach or full bowels. That's his idea. That you should better to evacuate yourself before you travel. But he said that's only if you have a digestive condition. As I, Rav Papa, am a healthy man, I can eat as much as I like when I travel. Okay, consider that the next time you're packing your flight bag with snacks. Okay, but that's not what we're going to look at. But that's the context. We're still in a longer passage about famine, which is going to prompt us into a much deeper consideration of suffering, which is, of course, the way of the Talmud. You think you're talking about packing snacks for a trip and full bowels and whatnot, stuff that you really wouldn't give much mind to, and then all of a sudden you're hit with something very deep indeed. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. So Rabbi Judah said in the name of Rav, that's the way the Talmud talks. Kol ha mar'iv atzmo bishnei re'avon. So mar'iv, resh ayin bet, is the shoresh or root of a word that means to be hungry. So anyone who starves himself, who mar'iv atzmo, who starves himself, makes himself hungry, bishnei re'avon, in a year of famine, or here it says years of famine, nitzal mimita, he is saving himself from death, mishuna, an unusual death, literally a different kind of death. In other words, starving yourself in years of famine will protect you from being hit by a bus. All right, that's what they mean by unusual death. The rabbis are at least smart enough to know that starving yourself in years of famine is not actually promoting medical health, right? This is not something you do to promote medical health. I would say this resides in the dimension of what is right ethically and spiritually. And therefore, the kind of death that it might help you prevent or avoid is not, it's not going to promote the kind of health that's going to allow you to live a long life and avoid getting heart disease or cancer. It's going to confer upon you a kind of spiritual protection. If you obey, if you respond to a famine by rationing your own food and undertaking a measure of hunger, at the very least, God will protect you from an unusual death. Does that make sense, at least how and why the rabbis are getting there? I'm filling in a lot of the gaps. I'm going to show you the text again so that you can see how it comes up. And they use a proof text from what is the book of the Hebrew Bible that talks at greatest length and in greatest depth about the nature of suffering. Of course, it is the book of Job, the innocent man who suffers grievously just because God accepted a dare from Hasatan, the adversary, who is sometimes translated as the Satan, but don't think red jumpsuit, pitchfork, scary goatee, think a lawyer. Satan is the adversary who prosecutes humanity in the court of God. In Jewish lore, in Jewish legend, going all the way back to the time of the Tanakh, the Bible, and the book of Job specifically, Hasatan means the adversary. It is one of the members of God's divine court, an angel. Later, Milton and others would depict Satan as the fallen angel Lucifer, the angel who used to be one of the faithful members of God's court, but now exists in order to tempt and prosecute humanity. And in biblical lore, as in the later rabbinic imagination, the role of the Satan is to expose all of the frailties and foibles of humanity. And that's how Satan functions in the Job story. Hey, God, you've got this great, God says, I've got this amazing servant. His name is Job. He's the most righteous man in the whole world. Look at how wonderful Job is. And Satan says, well, yeah, of course he's the most pious man. He has everything. He's rich. He's happily married. He has 7 kids. He has land. He has flocks. He has herds. He has employment. He's healthy. Take it away and see how pious he remains. And God says, okay, great idea, Satan, and does just that. So this is really the book about, the nature of suffering. And so one of the lines is, in famine, God will redeem you from death, which suggests not that, you're doing anything to practice good health and wellness. It's that God is intervening so that you will be saved even in a time of suffering and death for the whole community. And if you'd like to see the verse in its context, you just click on it, and here it is. It's probably meaningful to look at the context here so you can see who's speaking it in the book of Job. Whenever a proof text is brought in Gemara, in any rabbinic literature, you really want to go back to the original and see how does the text function in the original, not just what did the word say, but what's the context. Text and context, you need both. So look at how this goes. All of this is part of a long speech. Let's see who's delivering it, though. Most of Job is poetry. It's speaking. And I just want to show you, finally, it's the beginning of chapter 4. Eliphaz the Temanite. Teman is today's Yemen. So Job is, by the way, not living in Eretz Yisrael. He's a Gentile. He's not depicted as a member of the Israelite nation. He's not Jewish. So he has a buddy. He has 3 buddies, one of which is a guy named Eliphaz from what is Yemen today. And he goes up to Job and he says, if one ventures a word with you, would it be too much? Do you mind, Job, if I share a little bit? And this is, of course, false humility, because he's going to speak to him for paragraph after paragraph and not let Job get a word in edgewise. He says, but who can hold back his words? I don't like Eliphaz the Temanite. I think he's an obnoxious jerk. But he says, but actually, I can't bite my tongue, Job. And then look at the context. He says, see, you have encouraged many. You're such a good guy. You've helped so many people. You've helped other people who are suffering. But now that you're suffering, it's really throwing you for a loop. And he goes on to say, you must have done something wrong. And that's where and he keeps going into a second chapter. I don't want to unpack all of the poetry. It would take us a whole semester. Evil does not grow out of the soil, nor does mischief spring from the ground, for man is born to do mischief. In other words, you must have done something wrong, Job. You may think that you're perfect, but it's in your nature. It's in all of our nature. We're all wrongdoers. We're all sinners. And so if God is punishing you, or if you are suffering, it must be because God is punishing you. And he's basically saying, you may think you're such a good guy, but you're really not. And then he's saying, and whatever God is doing is for your own good. See how happy is the man whom God reproves. Do not reject the discipline of the Almighty. Yada, yada, yada. I mean, very, very troubling stuff. Finally, we get to the verse in question. But God is going to be there for you in your time of real need. In famine, God will redeem you from death. So this guy decides that what Job really needs is a lesson in theology. He's in abject pain and suffering, and what his friend really can bring him is the comforting message that he must have done something wrong, but don't worry, God will redeem you too. Yuck. Nevertheless, the pshat of the verse, the simple meaning of the verse is, well, in a time of famine, God will redeem you. And the rabbis use that in the Gemara as their proof text to suggest that fasting or depriving oneself when the community is suffering has a kind of protective function. it invites divine favor. This is derived from the precise wording of the verse. Steinsaltz tells us, according to its straightforward meaning, instead of in famine, it should have said from famine. God will redeem you from famine, meaning death caused by famine, which is not a normal way to die, right? It's not disease or old age. It's an act of God. One is delivered. Okay, rather, this is what the verse is saying. As a reward for starving himself in years of famine, Job, they're using Job as the exemplar of the one who suffers, will be saved from an unusual death. So I'd love to pause here and invite your thoughts, questions, comments. Like, what is being discussed here? What is the role of the individual vis-a-vis the community when the famine comes? Like, what can you infer from this text already about what the rabbis think a proper response to suffering might be? Okay, Mom and Dad, you can unmute and share.
All I can say is being relieved of the worry of being hit by a bus doesn't get rid of my hunger pains today.
Right.
I don't understand this reasoning at all. I really don't.
Well, okay. Well, let me frame it this way.
How about?
So, and then I'll get Judy in a second. I want us to consider, I'm not going to tell you what I'm thinking. I'm going to give you more to think about. I want us to consider today, what motivation does an individual have for voluntarily taking on an act of self-deprivation?
Sure,
But that's one of the things, right? Why would a person, presumably if a person, especially not everyone during a famine is starving. That's another assumption that I'm making. So this is a person who may voluntarily be depriving oneself. And I agree with you, not having the protective benefit conferred of not being hit by a bus, but it could also be you won't die of the famine if you deprive yourself during the famine, which it might be counterintuitive. Judy.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was actually going to also say that obviously if you deprive yourself, and we're talking about a community, then somebody else will get more, or somebody who won't get anything will maybe get something.
Right.
And your reward is for the kindness that you show towards other people and not totally self-absorbed in how you have to stay full and healthy and whatever.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for framing this in a kind of equation of resource allocation. Right? If you accept less, not to the point where you kill yourself, but if you voluntarily take less, the potential arises for one who needs more to have more. We're going to be, this is the theme we're exploring today, so I don't need you to have all the answers. I just want to reside for a few minutes in this place of contemplation. Joe Levine and then Alan. Unmute yourself, Joe, though. That's the only way we'll hear you. All right, while we're waiting for Joe to unmute, Alan, you're next.
Well, in my business, you have years of plenty and years of drought. I'm not on a salary that's consistent. You can have a great year. It could be followed by bad years. So the concept here is that in years of plenty, you act as if it's a drought. So that when there is a drought, you could live normally. You don't do that, the bus is not really a bus. The bus is a symbol for something unexpected.
Right.
So if you're living high on the hog, excuse the expression, if you're living high on the hog, and then the following year you have an unexpected calamity like COVID, you're not a burden on the community, and your family survives.
Spoken with the wisdom of another biblical figure whom we admire, who is Joseph. Right. That's exactly what Joseph did when he was able to foresee 7 years of plenty, which is great, followed by 7 years of famine. And he's like, here's what we need to do. We need to stockpile now so that we can ration later. Okay, beautiful. Joe, you're up, and then Audrey.
Just want to make sure I'm unmuted.
You are unmuted.
Okay. With the model of suffering and to talk about famine, it took me back to my childhood, and I'm a child of the end of the Depression and the First and the Second World War, where whenever I couldn't finish what I had on my plate, my parents would say, "But they're starving over there, wherever over there was." And I think the idea of the famine aspect is more allegorical in terms of you're developing a compassion for people who do not have what you may have.
Yeah.
And therefore, even though it doesn't affect them per se, if you're eating or not eating, or it just is a sign to God, to somebody, to some higher authority, that you are attempting to do the right thing.
Beautiful.
Out of your compassion for others.
Think of the texts we study and the wisdom we receive from the prophets on the day of Yom Kippur, right? The Haftarah for the morning of Yom Kippur comes from the book of Isaiah, and its most famous lines, not that any line can be more famous than another, but the lines that I think we remember best are, "Is this the fast I have chosen? Bowing my head like a reed, covering myself in sackcloth and ashes. Is not the fast you, or is this the fast you have chosen?" In other words, God, it's an address to God. "Is it not to unshackle the fetters of those in bondage and to deliver those who need hope?" And on and on and on and on. In other words, fasting is meaningless if it is merely the rote performance of a ritual act intended to secure, your reputation for piety in the eyes of God. Fasting is meaningful only if it is a goad or a guide to deepened and broadened empathy. The whole point of a fast is maybe for 24 hours you can experience what it is like not to have a full belly. And maybe you will emerge from the fast of Yom Kippur that your atonement is secured, not because you were attentive to the ritual, or because you're so pious for depriving yourself, but because you emerge from the fast much more empathic and able to understand that you can help feed the hungry. Right? There are people for whom Yom Kippur is not one day a year, it's every day of their lives. And they're not, by the way, just people who are on the streets of New York. Food insecurity is, affects billions of the world's 8 billion people. They don't have 3 square a day. And you have many people in America who are not homeless, but who are living in a state of food insecurity. So just something to think about. Audrey, how about a comment from you, and then we'll return to the text.
Well, I was going to say, whereas I like the last explanation and your explanation much better, on an individual basis, if you do fast occasionally and you are also strengthening yourself and your ability to withstand something else that might come. And that, as not being part of the community, but on an individual basis, that could help you fight off something else.
Right. Okay. Yes. And by the way, a personal incentive or motivation for taking on a fast during a community-wide year of famine, a time that affects everyone, there is an incentive that is entirely selfish. Right. It's not all altruism, right. But there is also an altruistic motive that we're going to get into. So let's take a look here. Thank you, Audrey. Similarly, Reish Lakish said, "It is prohibited for a person to have conjugal relations in years of famine." Now, I wish that Steinsaltz had trusted us to figure that out on our own, because you're really smart. Obviously, the demands on the population will increase if the population increases during a time of limited of scarcity. So you would voluntarily abstain from overcrowding the population. As it is stated, what's your proof text? "And to Joseph," there he is, right? Because he's our other exemplar of leadership through famine. As is stated, "And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of famine came." And the rabbis are doing what the rabbis do, which is hyper literally reading the text. They're over reading the fact that the text specifies that Joseph's kids were born before the famine, right? In other words, the text gives us the exact time frame for when Joseph's wife, Potipharah, had, or no, was it the daughter of Potipharah, Asenat, that she had her kids before the famine. So they want to make it clear that Joseph himself was not just imposing restrictions on the community during the years of famine. He himself did not grow his family when the community was suffering. It was taught in a baraita, an extra Mishnaic teaching. Nevertheless, those without children may have marital relations in years of famine because the overriding mitzvah is to bring children into the world. So if you already have kids, it's not a time to grow your family. If you have no kids, it is permitted. It's not required, it is permitted to have children. Okay. I think that's self-explanatory, so we'll move forward. Tanu Rabbanan, another Mishnaic teaching. That's a formula that tells us we're back in the layer of the Mishnah here, still in the layer of the Mishnah. The sages taught in a baraita, when the Jewish people is immersed in distress, and I want you to see the Hebrew, Bizman, at the time, She Yisrael Shruyin Bitsa'ar. Tsa'ar. It's like Sarot, which means tsuris, but it's a little bit different. Sa'ar means pain. So, pain, like physical, it's a physicalized word. So at a time when the Israelites, when the people of Israel, the Jews, are in distress, Shruyin Bitsa'ar, Uferas echad mehen, and one person separates himself from the community, Bayin shnei malachei hasharet. Now, this is a phrase you know. Shalom aleichem malachei hasharet. There they are. Come, O ministering angels. Greetings unto you, malachei hasharet, the ministering angels, playing on the legend that we walk through this world accompanied by divine beings who escort us to and from wherever we're going, that we walk in divine protection, and especially on the Sabbath, or as the Sabbath arrives, the ministering angels take us to and from the shul, to and from our house of worship to our homes. It's quite a lovely idea, the idea of ministering angels who are there to walk by our side. So the text here stipulates, at the time when the Jewish community is suffering as a collective, and one person separates himself from the community, what happens? The ministering angels come to him, okay, and I'm going to swing over to the English here. Two ministering angels who accompany a person come, and they place their hands on his head as though he were an offering, should be as though he were, and they say, this person, so-and-so, in the Hebrew, I love this, it says, the Hebrew word for Jane Doe or John Doe is Ploni. Ploni just means a someone, a guy. Ploni ben Almoni is a way of saying John Doe in Hebrew. Okay. This so-and-so who has separated from the community, let him not see the consolation of the community. If you choose at a time when your Jewish community is in need to say, not my problem, whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean physically separate, like move out of the Jewish community. It just means to say, I am not engaging in this. This is not my issue. 14,000 Ukrainian Jews made Aliyah last year. So for the American Jewish community to have said, which we did not say as a collective, but for even one person to say, yeah, that's their problem, it's not my problem. Let the state of Israel absorb them, right? That is not how Judaism and Jews think about the communal burden. When an entire community is suffering, all Jews are responsible. This fulfills another Talmudic maxim or edict known as Kol Yisrael Arevin Ze Bazeh, usually translated all Israel or every Jew is responsible for every other. All Israel is responsible for one another, though the word responsible, Arevin, literally means mixed up with. In America, we've got this great saying, it's called mind your own business. That is not indigenously a Jewish notion. I think the Jewish version is your business is my business. And if you've ever met anyone who has the reputation of being a yenta, you understand this deeply. It cuts both ways, but usually it is deemed as a positive attribute of the Jewish tradition and the Jewish people, right? That the phenomenon of the yenta. that your business is my business. There is no such thing as that's just their problem. So for one actively to choose to disengage from the life of the Jewish community at a time of distress, the ministering angels come to that person and they put their hands on his head. It's this really incredible image and say, this one will not see, or may this one not see the consolation of the community. In other words, when the good time comes, when the community has occasion to rejoice, this person will also remain separate. You don't get to experience the good and welfare, the good and well-being when you distance yourself when times are hard. You can't be a fair weather friend to the Jews. I love this text. Again, I don't get too hung up on the legendary or fantastical elements of the text. I'm reading it for its ethical wisdom. It's an allegory, of course. Let's read on a little bit and then we'll take some more thoughts. But I think these aren't quite so difficult to unpack. They're more transparent than opaque. A similar idea is taught in another Baraita. When the community, always the Jewish community is what is meant, of course, is immersed in suffering, a person may not say, I will go to my home and I will eat and drink, and peace be upon you, my soul. Like, I'm gonna sleep well tonight. And if he does so, here's the verse that applies to him. That would be my translation. We're going to find a verse from Isaiah that specifically can be applied to this scenario. The verse says about him, and behold, joy and gladness, the slaying of oxen and the killing of sheep, which is a good thing, by the way. Slaying oxen, killing sheep means you're about to have a feast. It's not about killing animals. It's about abundance. Behold, joy and gladness, slaying oxen, killing sheep, big party time. Eating flesh, that's a good thing. Eating meat. I wouldn't say eating flesh. That sounds like horror movie stuff. No, eating meat, which was a privilege of times of luxury, or people who experience luxury at all times. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. All right, that's if a person is thinking that, like, I got it good, party time, I'm going to have a nice big feast, let the wine flow, let us serve the most expensive Kobe steaks. And then the prophecy continues with what is written afterward in the following verse. And the Lord of hosts revealed himself in my ears. Surely this iniquity shall not be expiated by you until you die. So it's very clear that the judgment of the Lord is that such an attitude, such a hedonistic gluttony is not smiled upon by the prophet. Right? And if you want to know the full context, you click and you look over to your right and you see. So the Jewish community is in distress. My sovereign God of hosts summoned on that day to weeping and lamenting, to tonsuring and girding with sackcloth, all signs of deprivation. And what is happening here, it's describing an attack on Jerusalem. The many breaches in the city of David. I don't want to get into the historical context, but many scholars believe this is related to the assault in the time of Hezekiah in the 7th century BC, 6th century BC. Don't quote me. And you counted 7th. And you counted the houses of Jerusalem and pulled houses down to fortify the wall. And so the community's under attack, right? And you constructed a basin, etc. And what was designated was a fast day, a day of public mourning, which often was called in times of distress, communal distress. The monarch, the priest, or the prophet in the name of God would say, everybody needs to fast, right? Everybody needs to engage in acts of self-deprivation to propitiate the deity, in order to invite divine favor in a time of need, whatever. But instead, what did the people do? They went and had parties. Let the wine flow, we'll sacrifice. And God said, I'm not forgetting this. I am not forgetting that when my community was in distress and we called a time of deprivation, you lived it up. Any comments on any of this so far? It's a really rich passage about the interplay between a community that is suffering and the responsibility on the individual in the community. I'd love to hear just your reflections or thoughts. And welcome, Russell, who's just joined us. Well, let's look at one more then. Okay. All right. Ad kan midat benonim. Really interesting phrase. Up until this point, we are talking about middling people. That's not a very nice, but benonim literally means average. Middling is a little bit, you know, every word, when you translate, every word has a unique shading. And I think there's a difference between calling somebody average and middling. Middling just feels a little bit more of a slap in the face. But okay, but they wanted to use the word benonim, which comes from the word bain, which means in between. So this is like a middling person, an average person. So we are just talking about how average people behave. Let's read on and see where they're going with this. Who merely exclude themselves from the suffering of the community. In other words, these are people who say, not my problem. I see the Jewish community is suffering. I personally am fine. I am not affected. I can distance myself from this. I don't need to do anything. And especially, I'm not going to fast. Like, thank you very much. But that is not, that's for them. Like, I've done nothing wrong. I don't need to get him. Okay, you get it. That is an average person would say that. What about, the text now asks, what about the wicked? In other words, that's not merely distancing yourself is an average behavior, middling. You're not going to get any gold stars for it, but it's also not as bad as what it could be. What about wicked people? What is written about those who hope for more of these days? That's how Steinsaltz gets at it. Why would anyone hope for more of these days? I mean, what kind of a monster do you have to be to wish that your community would suffer? Probably one who assesses that when others have less, I have more, or I can get more. Or somebody who rejoices in the disadvantaged being exploited or watching the disadvantaged suffer. It's pretty damning that the rabbis do not seem to struggle to imagine people like this. But let's read on. Okay. All right. What is written about them? So what kind of people are these? Come, I will fetch wine, and we will fill ourselves with strong drink, and tomorrow shall be as this day, and much more abundant. In other words, party time. And what is written afterward? The righteous perishes, and no man lays it to heart. In other words, all the good people are dying. They are the ones who are suffering, and nobody's paying attention. Nobody is really taking this seriously. And godly men are taken away, none of them considering that the righteous is taken away from the evil to come. In other words, that maybe the righteous are being spared the doom that awaits those who rejoiced while they were suffering. This verse teaches that righteous people suffer early death to prevent them from witnessing the harm that will befall these evil people. So, you know, the prophets often speak in the language of justice coming as rectification for transgression, right? That people may suffer here and now, but God's justice will come. And that maybe the reward, I mean, this is a little bit twisted, but the only reward that these poor souls who are good people who suffered and died is that they were spared the horror that will befall those who inflicted such pain on them in time to come. Audrey. Unmute. Yeah.
Oh, I did. It's a little bit off topic, but I have two parts. First of all,
Sure,
I really believe what you just said, because I think about my parents with not only COVID, but the rise of anti-Semitism, and they're not having to go through it again. But the other thing I had was actually from the previous passage where it says, that you will carry the pain of what you've done until you die. But I think that's an assumption that when you die, it's all over and there's no afterlife. But at some point, I think some Jews at least believed in an afterlife. Could this be carried forward?
So what I want to do by way of responding to your question, I don't know if I'm going to answer it, but by way of responding to it is continue the text and let's see where this goes. Because it comes in the text itself.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yep. In other words, you're asking the right kind of leading question. Okay, so where does this go? The Baraita continues. Rather, here's the prescriptive element. A person should be distressed together with the community. If the Jewish people are suffering, you must also suffer along with us. As we found, now who's the example of this? Moses. As we found with Moses, our teacher, that he was distressed together with the community, as is stated during the war with Amalek, the arch enemy of the Israelite nation. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat upon it. Now, what's the context here? So Moses is up on a hill, and he's observing the Israelite people are under attack by Amalek. And what we know from the book of Deuteronomy, by the way, is that the way Amalek attacks is particularly nefarious because Amalek sneaks up from behind and cuts down all the stragglers in the rear of the community. So he doesn't even fight fair. He, meaning the personified nation of Amalek, from which, by the way, come such savory characters as Haman, and some even say Hitler was the 20th century incarnation of the Amalekites. So there is a Jewish legendary tradition that all of the worst bad guys in all of Jewish history are descended, as it were, from Amalek. Moses is watching this happen, and God instructs him, here's what you need to do. Hold out your hands over the community with your rod in your hand, and so long as your hands are extended out over the community, the Israelites will prevail in battle. But if your hands drop, right, if you, and we're talking about hours and hours and hours of doing this. Like, I don't know, I can't do it for more than a few minutes. Your hands become, if your hands drop, all of a sudden the Amalekites will surge and start prevailing in battle. So the story goes on to say that in order to prevail, Moses kept his hands out, and there are incredible, throughout history, artistic depictions of this. Just look up Moses and Amalek and see all the, I'll find one for you. There's paintings of it, oil painted, like all throughout history. Joshua on one side and Hur, another dude, like Ben-Hur, but his dad. Hur take their hands and hold Moses up. And so long as they do that, the Israelites win. But of course, this is not just a great fun story or a subject for painting. I'm looking up, if I just Google Moses Amalek and I hit image, I'll show you. This is like, I knew this would happen. I didn't try this ahead of time. Here's what you get. Like, here's an image. Oh, Word on Fire. I had an article published in their journal this year. It's a Catholic evangelical journal. So this image here, right, there he is. There's Moses and Hur holding up, Aaron and Hur holding up Moses's hands so that the Israelites who are fighting down here with the Amalekites, look at the chaos of battle, will win, right? That's the famous depiction. So going back now to the Talmud, what is the Talmud? How is the Talmud using this? It's making it clear that when Moses' hands were heavy, they took a stone and they put it under him and he sat upon it. So they're like, okay, we're going to do what we can to bolster you. But didn't Moses have a single pillow or one cushion to sit upon? Why was he forced to sit on a rock? So they're not even playing on the idea of when Moses is suffering, Aaron and Hur come to the rescue. They're like, Moses should have had like a nice fancy cushion or a chair to sit on. But instead, when the people were suffering, they found a rock for him and Moses sat on the rock because when Moses said as follows, since the Jewish people are immersed in suffering, I too will be with them in suffering as much as I am able, even though I'm not participating in the battle. The Baraita adds, anyone who is distressed together with the community will merit seeing the consolation of the community. So that's the inverse of what was said before. The leader has to suffer too. The leader can't be, Moses can't be in his tent having a glass of wine while his people fight. So it's a really nice passage. Judy. Unmute, my friend.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking at the very beginning of the passage when you started, and supposedly God asks Cain, where is your brother Abel? And he says, I'm not my brother's keeper. I don't know where he is. And so I think that the underlying message personally for myself is with the community and basically people in general, it is our responsibility to be concerned about the other people. We can't just say our brother is gone.
Beautifully articulated, and thank you for using proof text. That's very, very rabbinic of you. There are two questions that are asked in the opening chapters of the Torah. In chapter 2, after Adam and Eve have transgressed and they cover up their nakedness with fig leaves, God asks this great question. It's the first question asked in the Torah, and it's asked by God of the human beings. Ayeka, specifically of Adam, which means, where are you? And the rabbis comment that this is not a geographical question. This is a spiritual question. Where are you? How have you lost not your way geographically? How have you lost your way morally? It is one of the great, I believe that all of Judaism must be a response to that question, that we relate to a God who is asking, Ayeka, where are you? The other great question that is asked early in the book of Genesis is asked by Cain, when God accuses him. And he says, Hashomer achi anochi? Am I my brother's keeper? God does not answer this question. But one could argue that the entire Torah, in fact, all of Judaism, is a resounding yes to that question.
Absolutely.
Everything else that comes in the Torah, from Abraham arguing over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah with the judge of all the earth and saying, shall not the judge of all the earth do justly, do justice, to the Talmud passages we're reading today, to the way in which Israel understands the law of return and the need for a homeland for the Jewish people, is that, of course, you're a brother's keeper, because Kol Yisrael arevin ze bazeh. Every Jew is responsible for every other. And indeed, I extend this to the human plane.
Right.
As Emmanuel Levinas said, and that we have enshrined in the temple on the big community tzedakah box right outside the coat room in the main atrium, we are obligated by the mere gaze of another.
Agree. Absolutely.
We are obligated by the mere gaze of another.
That's the truth.
Right? You cannot separate yourself from the suffering of your people or of people.
Of people.
Okay. Beautiful, Judy. Thank you for prompting that. We'll read just a little bit more because I promised Audrey this was going to give her some kind of response to her question. The Baraita further states, unless the person say, well, I've acted in secret, who will testify against me? In other words, who knows? You know, a lot of crimes and misdemeanors. Whom have I really hurt? Right? Who am I really hurting by doing this? The Tana, meaning the ancient reciter or teacher of the law, explains that the stones of a person's house and the beams of a person's house will testify against him. As it is stated, for a stone shall cry out from the wall, and a beam out of the timber shall answer it. In the school of Rabbi Shela, that's not Rabbi Sheila, it's a guy, Rabbi Shela, they say, the two ministering angels who accompany a person will testify against him, as it is stated, for he will give God's angels charge over you. In other words, there is no such thing as an invisible crime. your very home, as it were, will testify against you. You can run, but you can't hide. Ethics are not just about what you can get away with. And here we go. Rabbi Chidka said, they're still trying to answer this question. A person's soul will testify against him, as it is stated. Keep the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your bosom. In other words, that which is inside of you, not an externalized, not another person, but keep the doors of you. Be careful, because the mouth is a tool to express what's in here. And some say a man's limbs will testify against him. As it is stated, you are my witnesses, says the Lord. Which is why I've said your mouth can say one thing, but if your shoes are saying another thing, trust the shoes. Your mouth says, I'm going on a diet. Your shoes just walked into a bakery. Who are you going to trust? Okay? In the battle between your mouth and your limbs, trust your limbs. Your feet tell you a lot more about a person than the mouth does. Here's where we're going with this. The Baraita cites another verse that deals with judgment, a God of faithfulness without iniquity, God who is just and righteous, from Deuteronomy 32. The Baraita interprets a God of faithfulness to mean that just as punishment is exacted from the wicked in the world to come, even for a light transgression that they commit. So here's your answer, Audrey. So too is punishment exacted from the righteous in this world for a light transgression that they commit. In other words, the righteous suffer their punishment in this world in order to purify them so that they can enjoy the world to come. That's their response. But the bigger picture is that the rabbis invent or imagine a hereafter, a next phase of spiritual existence that will make up for all of the injustices of this world. I don't personally buy it. I empathize with the rabbis who are moved to find ways of reconciling the obvious pervasiveness of good people who suffer and wicked people who prosper against what they believe a righteous God wants for the world. That's the delta that the rabbis they're in that delta of this makes no sense. Everything we know about God and God's demand of righteous conduct and God's promise of being in covenant with the people and being good to the people and bestowing blessings on the people is completely incompatible with the real world. And again, we're going to reflect on this for our remaining 15 minutes. I think where we've been living today, where we've been residing, where I chose to end our study for this semester is that there's a dimension that goes beyond, where our tradition is demanding that we expand our perspective beyond our individual suffering. That truly, to be Jewish, that the best response to suffering that we have in our tradition is empathy for others. I want to hear from Audrey and then Russell in that order.
Okay, but that's the inverse of what I said. In other words, it said the righteous will be relieved so that they can enjoy the world to come. But what about those who are not righteous? And it says your death.
Yeah. I'm sorry. So what audience are we talking about? People who are bad?
Yeah.
Yeah. They're going to be held accountable in the world to come.
Okay.
Yeah. And by the way, though, they too have a shot at redemption. The second section of the verse, and without iniquity, means that just as a reward is paid to the righteous in the world to come, even for a minor mitzvah that they fulfill, so too reward is paid to the wicked in this world for even a minor mitzvah that they fulfill. Which really, I think, bumps up and challenges the notion of inherent evil and inherent good.
Right.
The idea that at the end of the day, we are not really speaking in the language of all-encompassing character so much as we are kind of keeping a scorecard where even somebody who is by and large wicked can redeem oneself from punishment by doing mitzvot in this world. And that a mitzvah done by a wicked person is still a mitzvah. Okay. Russell.
Thank you.
I am very taken with the passages about who is going to testify against you when it says your own bones, your own mouth, the bones of your house. will all testify against you. I'm fascinated in part, first from the legal analysis, because it underscores the difference between human justice and divine justice. We, in our world, we live in a world of rational justice, which is based on demonstrable truth. But divine justice is based on something very, very different. And what I love most about the imagery of that is that it is not doing things that are wrong goes to the very essence of who you are. It goes to your bones. It goes to your mouth. It goes to the beams of your house. That it is the very core of you that needs to be improved, not simply the fact that you did an isolated act and it goes unnoticed. But in parallel to that, I think the passage, I believe from Deuteronomy, that we read every year on the High Holy Days, that says, the word that I'm giving you is not somewhere out there, it's in your mouth. It's already in you. I'm giving it to you so that you absorb it into your being. And it seems to be, to me, a very promising corollary to the imagery raised by this passage.
Beautiful. Thank you for testifying. I'd love to invite other reflections on the passage we've studied today. Questions, thoughts, comments? Michelle.
So it's not explicitly addressed here, but I note that even while they are talking about paybacks in the world to come, people who the rule of law is not avoided, so that people who do things that are explicitly wrong in the current world would also be prosecuted in the Jewish court or punished.
Right. We're really talking about transgressions that are not crimes necessarily. Right. And that's why even to distance yourself from a person or a community that is suffering is not considered wicked behavior. It's considered average. But of course, it's not just in Lake Wobegon that everyone is above average. The mandate of the Jewish people is to be above average. Average isn't good enough. It's not okay to be like everyone else. Thank you for that insight, Michelle. Appreciate it. Eve, and then my parents. Unmute. Yep. Thank you. I see you reaching for the unmute key. There you go. Nope, you're still muted. There you go.
Okay. It sort of goes to the what happens these days. I remember with our kids that if you do something there, there's always somebody around who sees it, and it gets back to your mother.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there was a Pirkei Avot passage that we looked at that basically said, in effect, there is always an eye that sees. Right. I, capital EYE. Yeah. Not a human eye necessarily, but in the world of Jewish ethics, the fact that nobody discovers your sin does not make it less of a sin.
Right.
Right. We do not accept an ethic of whatever it takes to get ahead, particularly on the backs of a community that is suffering. In a way that's even more egregious, to pursue self-advancement, self-fulfillment, self-pleasure when others are suffering is particularly an affront to the divine and to the community. Mom and Dad.
Did I misread that? Read this, or is there the postulate that the righteous who are suffering now will die early so that they won't have to witness the
Correct.
suffering that I will bring upon their malefactors?
Yes.
I mean, that's like saying we put all these people to death in gas chambers so that they wouldn't have to witness the Nuremberg trials.
Well, that's a fairly dark way of going, you know, in the perhaps illogical extreme of this text, but yeah, that is what it says.
Yeah, I'm going to remain one of these people that's not comforted today.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I do, again, one of the lessons I extract from this that does comfort me, or that I think is that does comfort me, is the notion that the Jewish response to the suffering of others is to join them in their suffering and not to distance oneself from the community that suffers. All of the other theological implications, I probably, like you, can do without. But in terms of what this means for actual human beings, actual Jews who have to navigate a very complex world where good people suffer all the time, it is not a morally acceptable Jewish position to say, that's your problem, not mine. For me, that's the master thesis here. And then to go even further to say, and who's going to know that your very being will testify against you, as Russell eloquently, you know, emphasized, is a core part of how this text wants to inculcate its point. Audrey.
Well, now that your father brought up a dark
Yeah.
section, I was thinking something that was said before made the idea of the capos or whatever, the Jewish leaders who were sort of quasi pro their own people and trying to survive, you know, by doing the Nazis' bidding, you know, so that they could live longer or maybe survive.
Yeah, I have a different take. It's funny. This is the second time capos have, you know, again, this happens inevitably. There's nothing a rabbi can teach without somebody taking us into the Holocaust, which,
Sorry.
no, it's okay. It's expected. I've been rabbiing for 23 years. I fully expect that anything I teach will go to the Holocaust. And that's a comment on the era in which we're living, of course, and what matters to Jewish people today, and matters to me too. But it also, because in my view, the Holocaust is both historically and theologically sui generis, it doesn't really lend itself to any good comparisons, full stop.
Right.
It's very hard to make comparisons where the Holocaust is being held up as the thing to which something else is being compared. Like at some point, it is reasonable for the teacher to say, I don't accept the premise of the comparison because the Holocaust is unique. Full stop. Having said that, Capo came up last night in a community conversation with a regional director of the ADL who came to WRT. We had a wonderful conversation in the Sifriya, the library, and it was taped. It will be on the Temple's YouTube channel. I heartily commend it to everyone in our community because it was really interesting, and it was a panel discussion with me and David White, who's a friend of mine and the son of a colleague of mine and great guy. But we talked about, you know, the idea of the capo, and I think that this, which is often linked to the equally obnoxious, or I think dangerous language of referring to another person as a self-hating Jew, the Jew who acts against the interests of the Jewish community. Capos were, and I'm going to be really just sort of blunt about this, not to be forceful in pushing against your comment, Audrey, but just as a point of teaching. Capos were slaves. They were enslaved by the Nazis under pain of torture and death, and they were forced by the Nazis to harm their own people. Full stop. There was no volition in this.
Right.
Right? To refuse to do what the Nazis were ordering them to do was a death sentence. So they literally had guns to their heads. And these were the people, they didn't sign up for, like, you know, merit badges. They were selected by the Nazis. They were often the people who were already respected community leaders. And these Jewish slaves were forced by the Nazis to do horrific things to their own people. And so as much as the capos inflicted suffering on their own people, I think no one suffered in the Holocaust more than the capos, most of whom were executed by the Nazis when the Nazis decided they had done their job. So I've been called a capo before too, so I take this a little bit personally. It was an epithet leveled against me by an internet troll for having the audacity of speaking up for the rights of refugees. He said, well, by supporting Muslims coming in droves to this country, which is not something I said I supported, but by supporting Muslims coming to droves in this country, I was harming the interests of the Jewish community the same way you said, so you're a capo. So, for me, it's a little bit personal when I hear that word. In any case, so capos were victims of the Nazis, who also, through the capo, the Nazis inflicted particular hurt on not just Jewish bodies, but the Jewish psyche and the Jewish collective will. All the ways in which the Nazis demoralized and dehumanized their victims is a big part of the Nazi genocide. Genocide isn't just murdering people. Genocide is erasing people's identity and their will to persist and their will to self-identify. That's why I refer to what the Soviets did against the Jews. And by the way, in Russia today, this is still true, as genocide. I mean, many Jews were purged under Stalin in particular. Countless thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of Jews were purged by the Soviets. But also the comprehensive, more than 70-year program of erasing Jewish culture, Jewish religion, Jewish identity is also genocide. It is the state-sponsored effort to destroy a people. So anyway, sorry, soapbox. I'm coming down off the soapbox now. You can sit me on a rock with Moses. Thank you, Audrey. Michelle, comment here?
Yeah, I want to loop back to the beginning of this stuff. Even if I had found the things theologically incomprehensible, I followed the last several weeks and the beginning of today on these are responses to human suffering and to trying to understand these things. I'm having trouble with putting this last bit into that context and trying to figure out where the heck I'm supposed to go with it.
Yeah, it's funny because I would have been theologically satisfied, I think like you, from what I'm ascertaining from your comments. I would have been personally, just me, Jonathan, personally as a Jew, not even as a rabbi, I would have been personally theologically satisfied with the passage ending on, effectively, the Jewish response to the suffering of others, particularly when a whole community in distress, is to join them in their suffering. And to take on the responsibilities of the welfare of the community, no less than somebody who is deprived, particularly if you are a person who is in the category of the haves and not like your fellows in the have-nots. And that's the meaning, by the way, of community-imposed fasts, which is the overarching subject of this tractate of the Talmud. That's Tani, right? Why fast as a whole community? And then we get into individual transgression. Okay, I could have done without the whole world to come business. But we've been studying together a long time, Michelle, you and I, and many others in this little community. And, we've seen that the rabbis are insistent that this phase of our existence is not the end all be all. And that whether it was in order to compete with or respond to the rise of Christianity, that Jews also said, we believe that this world is not all there is, or itself as a response to the pervasive human condition of suffering, just to say, to be a person is to suffer, and therefore, and to suffer unjustly, where most of the suffering a human being might encounter was not because of something we did. And one of the ways in which the rabbis reconcile around that reality, around that awareness, is something better is coming. And that you will watch those who were wicked in this world get their due, get their just desserts in the world to come, which has nothing to do with ice cream, by the way. Desserts is related to the word to deserve. It's D-E-S-E-R-T-S. It looks like deserts, but it's just desserts. It's not D-E-S-S-E-R-T-S. Sorry, that's my English major brain helping you here. And more importantly, the righteous who may have toiled in suffering in their lifetime will nevertheless be rewarded in the world to come. I don't believe in that. And I think that it is a theologically very problematic framework. On the other hand, I recognize that it comes from a place of deep empathy with the human condition. It comes from a place of recognizing that the world that we envision, the world that we ascribe to what God wants, is a world in which only those who deserve it suffer. And those who live a life of righteousness get to enjoy the rewards of that. Unfortunately, that's not the actual world. And so they talk about a dream world. They call it an olam haba, the next world. But I don't think of it as chronologically. I think of it more as the kind of imagined world as it ought to be, which I think is a deeply Jewish notion too, right? Part of what drives Judaism and makes us a visionary religion about the future is that the Jew and the Jewish people are invited or even commanded to understand the difference between the way things are and the way things ought to be. Without that delta, without that tension, there's no forward motion. Right? And you don't need a personal Messiah to accept the general architecture of Jewish theology, which is that the way things are, the way things are, but to be a Jew is to see that things could be different. My theology is that let's not wait around for God to do it. Let's get working on it now, which is highly Kabbalistic, right? It's influenced by Jewish mysticism and the idea of tikkun ha'olam, that the world as it is, the way things are, is broken. But you can see that. That's godly, right? That's the divine image in you. The divine image in the human being is that who can see, or that which can see that things the way they are not the way they ought to be. Okay, that's my theology, Barbara. And then
what,
Ed, I seen your hand, so.
yeah, what strikes me is Christianity. The way all of Christianity is basically based on the suffering of Jesus.
Well, so yes, Christianity actually personifies all of this theology in the person and the story and the mythology of Jesus, right? But remember, rabbinic Judaism is growing up at the same time as the Catholic Church, as early Christianity, and so the two are actually in dialogue, though sometimes the dialogue is a polemic,
right?
One against the other.
Where does the notion of Jesus taking away your sins or dying on the cross for?
So it's very interesting. We didn't have time to get into it today, but I've been looking at this, and apparently there's a lot in. I did a teach last Saturday morning for the Sharing Shabbat adult community, the parents in Sharing Shabbat, where I talked about the idea of the Jubilee year, which was last week's Parsha, which was the remission of debt and redemption of slavery and landowning and things like that in the 50th year. Which the last chapters of the book of Leviticus describe. And Leonard Cohen, in one of his last songs, the song Treaty, off of his final album, You Want It Darker, talks about the Jubilee as a metaphor for the covenant between a lover and between two lovers, and between a lover and God. And this idea of both wanting to be released from the shackles of love and covenant, but also not being able to extricate oneself. And I found out that in Catholic theology, interestingly enough, the Jubilee year is a metaphor for not remission of debt or slavery, but remission of sin. Now, I don't know exactly where it comes from, but I think that a lot of biblical imagery, which was tied to agriculture and land-oriented festivals, take the Passover. It's the harvest festival for farmers and the spring lamb festival for shepherds. And that's why we slaughter a lamb in a ritual called the Pesach. And we also have 7 days called Chag HaMatzot, the Feast of Eating Unleavened Bread. It was a holiday that merged pagan customs for both the farming community and the shepherding communities. In the pre-Jewish, by the way, pre-Israelite even. But Israelite religion takes all of these pagan notions and syncretizes them into what will eventually become the Israelite and Jewish religions, Jewish ways of life. I don't think religion is the best word to describe what Judaism has ever been. Anyway, so the idea of early Christianity playing with these notions and allegory and turning these ancient practices into allegories and metaphors around the idea of redemption from sin is a fascinating part of how Christianity developed and attracted a pagan audience. It seems that whereas biblical Israelite religion was very focused on things like, farmers and shepherds and festivals where you would actually sacrifice things, Christianity developed a whole symbolic language where you weren't actually going to be physically liberated. Like, you may still be under the boot of Rome, but you can be liberated from the thing that imprisons every human being, which is one's own sinfulness. And the way you do that is not by making a sacrifice, not by following the mitzvot, but by accepting that the blood of Jesus Christ redeems you from sin. That's the sacrifice that counts. Now, again, I don't accept this theology. I'm just telling you how it developed. Okay, it's a great question. It's a whole semester-long course, some of which I've actually taught, that I'll probably teach again. Okay, Ed, you're going to get the last question, and then I'm going to do a final exercise for us. And then I have to end by noon.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks very much. One conceptual problem I always encounter when I'm participating in an elevated discussion like this is that a great deal turns on what is the whole question, what's your time frame? When you talk about human behavior, you're talking about a definition, a natural limitation on time frame and all your perceptions and values and adjustments and of your own behavior and others is based upon, and where and what are you doing today versus what you'll make up to do with tomorrow, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Whereas the biblical or Judaic measuring is not just 70 years plus, it's eternity. And if you're trying to understand what is justified or not, or what behavior is to be followed or not, you're stymied, or you have to deal not just with reconciling when bad things happen to good people, but what's your time frame?
I love that,
Ed. Your reaction.
And again, it takes thank you for your thoughtful insight and question, or invitation to just comment briefly. I think you're exactly right. And it also returns us to one of the master themes we looked at today, which is the interplay between the individual and the community. Because for the individual, it's not just time frame. I would say righteousness is measured day by day and mitzvah by mitzvah. And it's very individual. It's very, very clear. One of the conclusions that I think Judaism offers, the rabbis certainly offer, is that every mitzvah counts. Everything you do counts in the scale of merit or demerit. But let's say merit, let's make it positive. Every mitzvah you do advances joy and meaning and transforms the world from the way it is to the way it ought to be, to use my overarching theological frame for all of Judaism. And everything we do that is a transgression removes us from that. Communities like Chabad, Lubavitch Hasidic Judaism, actually focuses a lot on the whole aggregate effect, the collective effect, right? The more mitzvahs we can get the entire Jewish people to do, that's why they drive around in mitzvah trucks trying to get you to wave lulavs and put on tefillin. Because the more cumulative mitzvahs they do, the closer the world will be to Messiah. But I'm not sure that is the most authentic, and this is an unfair, authentic is a terribly loaded word, but I'm not sure that is the definitive way of understanding what Judaism teaches. That we're really collecting mitzvot for the whole community over eternity, as you say. I'm looking at both time frame and also the individual versus everyone in the Jewish world. Chabad Lubavitch says, let's take the entire Jewish people, and if every single Jew were only doing mitzvahs all the time, Messiah would already be here. Right? But I think that misses one of the core points, which is that we're not trying to change the world by getting the entire Jewish people to serve a redemptive function for a broken world. We want to emphasize the power of an individual to do a single mitzvah. I'm a reform rabbi. What, you know, so in a way, it's a matter of perspective. I believe that Judaism teaches, hey, you may have 70 years. Maybe if you're lucky, you'll get another 20. Maybe if you're really lucky, you'll get another 27. If you're really unlucky, you'll get half that or less. But do some mitzvahs while you've got the time. That 70-year time frame for me is a much more eloquent encapsulation of what Judaism cares about. It cares a lot about the power that an individual has to change the world, and does not spend nearly as much time on the collective effect of the entire Jewish community over eternity. But it's both, right? I mean, we live in both time dimensions, to use your concept of time frame being relevant here. We live in the dimension of the lifespan, but we also live in the dimension of human life. And the fact of the matter is, when I stand with a child this coming Saturday and hand her a Torah, I'm going to tell her that it came to her from Mount Sinai and not only from her parents. Right? So I get, but I want to make it clear that I operate in both metaphorical frames. What an amazing group you are and have been. What an amazing conversation you have offered and continue to offer. We're going to end with a little ritual where I'd love to share with you a prayer, which is the traditional way of concluding study. It's a special Kaddish called Kaddish de Rabbanan. It literally means the Kaddish for our teachers, but I'm offering it for you because you are also my teachers, as I have had the privilege of being one of your teachers. And I'm going to mute us all just so that if you want to read along, the Zoom thing won't happen where this is something I don't like about Zoom. You can't hear each other, but you can see each other and you can follow along as we offer and remember, Kaddish is a praise to the God of life. And in this case, it's also a praise to the God of our teachers. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'alma divrach yirutei, v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agalau v'izman kariv v'imru amen, yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach le'olam elomei almaya, Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitalev v'yithalal shemei v'kudusha brichu le'ela min kol birchata b'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'amiran bi'alma v'imru amen. And now the special paragraph that thanks all of the teachers of the Jewish people. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Talmidei Hon v'al kol Talmidei Hon, thanking God for all the students of their students. Ve'al kol man da'askin be'oraita, thanking all who engage in the study of Torah. Di ve'atra hadein v'di b'chol atar va'atar, yehei lahon uchon shlama rabba, fina v'chista v'rachamin, may God bestow grace and love and compassion upon them, v'chayin arichin, and a long life, umzonei revichei, and ample food, ufor kana, and meaningful engagement, min kadam avuhon di vishmaya, v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom bimromav hu ya'asei shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Here's the translation, reading the important paragraph. May the name of the Holy One be acknowledged, etc. Grant abundant peace to our people and their leaders, to our teachers and their disciples, and to all who engage in the study of Torah in this land and in all other lands. May you and they be blessed by our Creator in heaven with great peace, grace and kindness, compassion and love, and long life, abundance and deliverance. And let us say, Amen. It is a joy to learn with you. Please come to all of the wonderful in-person activities at WRT, including Shavuot, a week from tonight, May 25th, 6 o'clock, when we'll be led by our 10th grade confirmation class. Pay attention to the e-blast, which comes out while I'm teaching most Thursday mornings. And come back to shiur, learn more Gemara with us starting the first week of Elul. It's actually the day before the first day. Starting next class is August 17th. Take care.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope everybody stays well. It's been a pleasure working with everyone.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen, my friends. Be well. See you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund, Joe.